let's have your questions. If the hand doesn't go up soon, I don't know if it's really unfair of me to get the CEO of Collectively to say something about what we've just talked about. But a hand's gone up, so you're safe. If you just wait for the microphone, tell us who you are and where you work.
Is this on? Okay. My name's Alex Johnson. I work at Context. I just wanted to ask about the spectrum of consumers. There's two sort of very big brands and one NGO on the stage whose business revolves around, or in some part, around consumers. Where do you think we are with that? Because I think that's the missing link for me. That's what's going to change the votes. That's what's going to change policy, really drive the change. So, just like to see what your view is on that.
A really good point. I'm sure the others will chip in. Consistently through our market research of the last 10 decades, we've certainly found in the UK 4 groups of people. 10% probably like everybody in this room, passionately green, want a very different future. The other end of the spectrum, 20% not interested at all, mainly driven by income. The poorer sections of society have got other priorities in their lives. 2 groups in the middle, 35% roughly each. 35% light green. Of course we want a different future, but let's make it easy. Let's not pay more for it. Let's not have too many sacrifices. And 35% a little bit more cynical. Yeah, I want a new future, but I can't believe it'll ever happen. Show me 1 or 2 things that I can do to contribute to this bigger whole. Those numbers haven't changed. I don't suddenly believe that 10% of green people is going to suddenly become 50%. What people want are big brands, government leaders to make it easy for them, show them 3 or 4 things they can participate and move forward. The reason why it's such an important point is for we as consumer-facing organisations, unless you get a degree of signal, you're not going to move. You need that. And that's why, in terms of campaigns, I think the For Love of campaign from the NGO movement, 100 NGOs coming together to create a very emotional connection with consumers about what do you cherish and what would you miss if we had catastrophic climate change, plays back powerfully to us because it helps us work in tandem with consumers to say, I'll lead, but I need you to come with us. So that would be my take on where consumers are at this moment in time, but it's a vital question.
And that tallies with what we saw all around the world. So when we, as kind of the precursor to Collectively, actually looked at how young people specifically are making decisions all around the world, we worked with the World Economic Forum to actually map the human brain. And we did that in China, did that in India, did that in the US and here in Europe. And what we saw was that when a young person walks down the aisle and you ask them to make a sustainable purchasing decision, they're actually confused by the 320 different types of eco-labels that are out there at the moment. That's the overwhelming emotion. Whereas when you actually, and also the doom and gloom, the sense of, this is about compromise, it's about trade-offs, is also a huge turn-off to people. Whereas if it's actually about, this is just a simple decision that you need to make and you can be part of something bigger than yourself and it's a positive narrative. And it's about that kind of sense of they're doing something small but it's significant in the greater scheme of things, you absolutely get the decision. And that's consistent in India, China, all around the world. But the target group is not the 10%. It's not the people in this room. It's the 34% that we're calling aspirationals. These are the next layer out from you guys. These are the ones you should all be going away from tonight saying, I'm going to have a difficult conversation with somebody I've never spoken to about this stuff before, and you should be part of the solution here as well.
Yeah, no, I very much agree. It's about having that more, I think a stronger narrative actually around the opportunity that comes with this low carbon transition. It's got to be easy for people. People have got to understand it, what it means at their local level. What does it mean for their home, the way they live their lives, their business, their school, their community? And I think we need to pitch it much more in those terms. And as Mike has alluded to, that's very much the kind of angle of the For Love campaign, really trying to make it personal to people.
Sorry, say that again?
So you don't think there's been any movement on the numbers? Mike, you just said that there hasn't been any. Is that your experience as well?
I guess you're alluding to the fact that we've been through a recession. Do you expect people to sort of bleed away from this because times are tough? No. I think we found a consistent number of people saying, Marks and Spencer, we want you to be leading the way on this. The number of people that are consistently saying, and I'm right next to you being a green consumer directly, still remains the 10%. It's not become 5%, it's not become 20%. So I think things have remained pretty static. And when consumers say that to you, we as businesses have been missing the point because consumers are saying, we're not fickle on this, we're not changing. Yeah. You haven't yet found the solution yet to connect with us. That's why Collectively is so important because it brings an aspirational, positive message. It doesn't talk about deforestation and bad things. It talks about wonderful new architecture, clothing and food that you can have, but is also low carbon, better for the planet.
Thank you.
Yeah, gentleman here and then we'll come to you.
Ben Coombs, Llewellyn Consulting. We're an economic consultancy, and I think we buy into the structural change, structural transformation. I think everyone on this panel will be the winners in that structural change, that transition that is underway, that you are trying to accelerate. We also know through structural change that we get losers. We get losers in that structural change. How could collaborations and businesses work together, think through solutions of the vested interests, the people who are going to lose from the transformation? Of course there are opportunities, but we can't deny that there will be some losers. The example in Africa of the people around the lake, the resources, keeping those in the ground, keeping some of the coal in the ground, some of these things, how can companies work together to start thinking through, you're riding the crest of the wave, which will win, no doubt in my mind, but how can we work through to reach that tipping point?
Yeah, and is enough being done in that area? Enough focus on it?
And a very good challenge. I think by business getting more involved with carbon, business is a little bit more ruthless about winners and losers. If you don't move in the marketplace, there are winners and losers every day of your life economically. People who don't make the digital shift, they're just left behind. So I'm slightly harsher than you in saying some people will fail. Tough. We have to drive. Now, clearly, there are vulnerable parts of society, particularly globally, that you have to help transition. And I think the whole point about carbon finance, business has been very detached from. Leave it all to the policymakers, the World Bank and that. I think we as businesses have to be much more savvy about REDD+ and things like that. I think the whole area of carbon neutrality got a bad name for itself 7 or 8 years ago, the whole point about greenwash. And now I think we'll come back to it, albeit probably under a different name, about how we can help the potential losers in vulnerable parts of the economy and society transition to the brave new world, but there will be losers.
I think if we spend too much time trying to prop up the losers, I think we actually miss the opportunity to really create a new world that can benefit everybody. I think one of the lessons learned from, let's say, the banking bailout fiasco, who's dealt with that well, who hasn't dealt with that, the ones who haven't dealt with it well, they spent huge amounts of time and resource actually propping up failing institutions, failing systems. The ones who've just let the market reign, things fail, that happens, move on, create the new world. I think they have been, the better exponents of progress. I do think, though, that we need, out of, let's say, the big oil companies that are working with the API, 1 or 2 of those progressive oil companies to actually move forward with us, because that gives huge credibility and also scale. And yes, you've stranded assets and you've losers, but I think that's necessary.
Just a final point, an important question. I think one of the reasons that business has started to wake up to climate change, it started to see it's an existential threat rather than a compliance threat. Yeah, we might get fined £5,000 if we don't do something, I can live with that. Or we might have a campaign against us in the newspapers for one day. Now people are looking at business models like Zipcar, Airbnb, ripping apart the old way of selling stuff and owning stuff. And people are saying, if I don't fundamentally change in terms of what I do, I have no future. So again, I'm at this more positive end, like Neil, of just saying, the marketplace is changing, get with it.
Yeah. This existential threat versus financial threat. Can we ever see that changing?
Yeah, I tend to agree. Capitalism has got this kind of creative destruction within it, and the big guys can look after themselves, and it is, say, the coal mining community that's facing huge amount of unemployment that we need to think about that. But I think the creativity and the dynamism will see us through the transition.
Yeah.
I'm very wary of asking this question, given I'm sitting very close to the CEO of Collectivity, but I'm going to anyway. So it's Trine Restrick from Hubbub. Can businesses authentically lead social movements? If you look at what happened in this government, the biggest U-turn on environmental policy in this government was the forestry sell-off, which was an NGO-led social movement. So are you just talking up Collectivity because it's actually a movement you can control, rather than really an authentic grassroots social movement?
Yeah, go ahead, Neil.
So just to come back to the point that I made at the very start, and Will, I'm sure,
give you your right to reply.
Will reply beautifully on this, but the point of a movement is it's not about leadership. It's not about I'm out here, follow me, and trying to get the army to follow you. The point of a movement is actually to give power back to the people, and that's why companies like Purpose.org are so important. From all the different ideas we've been talking about, how that actually works in terms of activating people from a bottom-up perspective. Purpose, Blue State Digital and others have been instrumental, but the principles that any brand have to buy into to be part of that is to take your brand, take your ego off the table. But you can put your resources, your convening power, your assets into play in coalition with others in a way that actually can help them. Look at the Pepsi Refresh campaign. That's a very good example of doing something very purposeful in the US that the brand could be in partnership for. And that was almost like the beta example of what a brand can do to create a movement. And we've learned from that, and collectively is now, kind of the next iteration.
Do you want to say anything else? No? Okay. Let's hear from collectively then, very quickly on this point.
Thank you. So really good question and challenge. Thank you. The first thing is that, collectively, if it's going to succeed, has to be an independent platform. Okay, so you have, without a doubt, companies who are helping to fund it, but also you've got NGOs coming to the table, you've got social entrepreneurs coming to the table, you've got the global millennial audience. That's why it's a collective. It's not a collective of companies, it's a collective of different types of stakeholders. We know that as soon as people in our millennial audience feel the whiff of corporate BS, of CSR coming down the wires, they will desert it in a nanosecond. You won't see that happening. So absolutely, it does need to be ground up. Our audience need to believe in the integrity of collectively in order to participate, and that's what we're working on.
But you say as soon as they have a whiff of that, you've got a problem. They have had a whiff of that, though, haven't they? There has been a backlash against collectively and other coalitions to a degree. Am I right in saying that?
I think the only thing that we knew would happen at the launch of Collectively would be that there would be a few kind of journalistic platforms that would ask questions and just say, wow, with all these corporate partners behind it, well, surely it can't be true. And now we're on, that journey to carry on building trust, that people say, wow, this is a new kind of a dialogue that's got real authenticity to it. And that's our challenge.
Yeah, make it really quick.
So what happens when the millennials come up with a campaign which goes counter to the business aspirations of your funders? That's when the real sort of authenticity challenge hits. What will you do then?
Are you okay for us to carry on this conversation?
Yeah, respond to that one, then we'll move on.
So look, the editorial team themselves are as independent as our millennial audience. They themselves have already come up with plenty of things that have made our corporate partners go a little bit white, and they will carry on doing so.
I mean, true, to be very clear, there is a degree of grumbling from some of the corporate members saying, I'm contributing to this, but I'm not getting my stories on there. The editorial board has been very, very hard in terms of what it will accept on there. But to answer directly the challenge you set, we'll have succeeded if that happens. If we can instigate and generate a mass movement of millennials that want to reimagine the economy of the future, but create it potentially without us because we can't change fast enough, that's success for me.
Really?
Yeah. Very clear.
But also, I think, to innovate into that space, I think one of the gifts that Collectively actually gives corporations is by actually allowing millennials to work together on what they think the future could possibly look like. And doing that at scale then gives corporations not just insight, but foresight around where the world is actually going. And I think the challenge then is how we actually innovate into that space and underpin it.
Yeah.
Let's have another question. Yeah, right here.
Hi, Luke Nicholson from Carbon Culture. I think you're right about collectivity, to use it as a word rather than anything else, about collaboration. And I wondered, have you got a vision about how collaboration works between the collaborations? Or is there going to be one collaboration that's the one, and we should all join that one instead of a different one? If there are going to be multiple collaborations, how can they work together? Is it just a consumer-facing thing, or do we need evidence behind it? Do we need scientists to join in? Do we need economists to join in? What's the right one?
It's a really good one. I think Neil and I probably hinted at a slight difference of tack here, but let's explore it. I said halfway through the words that I said that I think there are three things that any big corporate can do. Back we means business, carbon tax, carbon reporting, renewable energy. Get involved with Collectively Face the Consumer, change your sector. Now that's slightly controlling, that's quite a traditional big business approach of let's do three things well. I think what Neil was challenging on, and Neil will expand upon this, say you can't really control in that way. Things will form, some things will succeed, some things will disappear and wither. I think somewhere between those two truths is the answer. But I don't want to see a situation where there's hundreds of different business coalitions tripping over each other. all looking for 5 minutes with the French president at midnight in Paris.
Trevor, I just want to hear your view on this as well.
Yeah, I mean, there's clearly a risk here in competing in the same kind of space, but actually I think, that each of these kind of coalitions brings something slightly different to the table, and I think it's about complementing each other rather than competing with each other.
And I think we should be encouraging some unusual coalitions as well, getting people that you wouldn't expect to be working together in the future, and I think that's a challenge for all of us, because we do tend to stay in our sectors.
Yeah, and maybe we're taking this a little bit too far, but I am. I talked to you about managing this process. Will we 5 years from now, when this becomes maybe uncontrollable in many ways, need a body that will manage this process and manage these coalitions to make sure it stays on the right path?
I think if you could actually take my entire team in BT and you could assign them to trying to actually be that body that would do the air traffic control around People's Climate, Action 2015, Project Everyone, For the Love Of, Here Now, and we can go on. We could do that, and we would probably not be successful in the next year. So I think what we need to do is we need to pick off the ones that we actually can see relevance in terms of our own organizations and our own challenges. For us, a big challenge is demand. How do we actually change the way people act and live globally, and how do we work together at scale to do that? Another big challenge is in the policy arena. How do we speak with one voice consistently in a way that actually overcomes what the deniers have been saying for the last 10 or 15 years? Yep. That's we mean business. And then how do we underpin that with a simple message that everybody can get behind, like the RE100, that we can push across our supply chains? And actually, if you were to actually back that up with something on the demand side around labeling energy, so you could see A to G in terms of its carbon intensity at point of supply, you could create new markets for energy A-rated power that collectively could come in behind and say, look at what this can do in terms of impact and so on. So they're the three things we focused on. If you're a celebrity in Hollywood, you may actually look at Project Everyone being something that could, Live Earth is another thing that, Al Gore and Pharrell Williams and others are behind. So I think it's about picking the things that you feel are most relevant to you and you can make the biggest impact through. And I think actually a lot of the integrity with which the relationships are carried out behind the scenes will see some of these things through. They won't all land well, but I think the ones that are pure in terms of their vision and have resource behind them will deliver impact.
Okay. Let's have another question. We've got time for maybe two more. Yes, lady in the middle there.
Good evening. My name is Ruth. I'm from Oxfam GB. So just picking up on a theme that came up earlier around the canary in the mine, part of the reason civil society has been waiting almost 15 years, to get progress on climate change is that nobody cared when it was just about the polar bears drowning and the less ice in the Arctic. But when the challenge came home, when it was my supply chain is going to be affected, I'm no longer going to be able to eat chocolate, suddenly people began to care. And so long as someone is either making a profit or there's vested interest in the short term, we're not going to get change. So how do we bring business on board when there isn't a business case to be made? So how do we bring Shell and those oil companies and those with fossil fuels in the ground on board when there clearly isn't a business case for them to get interested? I know you kind of touched on it earlier, there will be winners and losers, but when those potential losers have such vested interest and such power and such political influence, we do have to think about how we bring them on board.
And throw in there asking business to do things that are uncommercial for them. Helen, I don't know if you want to...
Yes, and it's partly back to the fact that investors own whole portfolios of companies, and there's a phrase from US academics about being universal owners, which means that big investors tend to own a slice of the economy. So I think the big investors have got a responsibility to help where they can with this transition and signal to some businesses which we need to grow dramatically and other businesses that need to play a different role. I also do genuinely feel that there's a huge amount of expertise in the oil and gas companies, which they're starting to use in the World Bank discussions around carbon pricing, for example, and they've fought through more clearly than a lot of us in this room exactly what needs to happen on a year by year and a decade by decade basis. So I think inviting them into some of these coalitions is hugely important as well.
And just be very clear, Ruth, these oil companies are running these scenarios now. If there's one thing that business craves beyond anything else, it's stability, to be able to make long-term investment decisions. The world we operate in now is febrile. Divestment campaigns, the risk that governments will be hit by civil unrest as the back of something like a Katrina or a Sandy Haiyan coming in, some draconian legislation is put down upon business from nowhere. Businesses are very nervous. The fossil industry is very nervous. That's why it's throwing these hundreds of millions of dollars at trying to protect the status quo. It knows it has to change. It wants to do it on its own terms. So I hear the challenge that you've set there, but I think these guys are running the scenarios behind the scenes that said, what if we have to divest from coal and shift into this? And you can already see some of the German utilities starting to shift away from the old model to a very different approach because they've been challenged by their government and policymakers to reimagine a very different future.
Yeah, question at the back. Hold on one sec. No, it's right here. It's right here.
Hi. It's on, is it on? It's Kate Larson. I have worked in Asia for a long time with factories making garments, shoes, accessories, and there's a lot of collaboration around the labor standards side. Better Work, Sustainable Apparel Coalition, the Alliance, the Accord, and yet very little when you walk into a factory on the environmental side. And I think specifically of Cambodia, Vietnam, Bangladesh, where we have miles of roofs with no solar panels on them. And we really don't have brands getting together as the buyers and saying, why don't you put solar panels on your roof? So a question somewhat to Mike Barry. I know that M&S have led with a Sri Lanka case study, but nevertheless, why are we seeing so much collaboration on standards, on how we assess the factories, but not on presenting solutions to how the factories can move up the standards in the supply chain? And not necessarily just those countries, but those are the hot, sunny ones with big roofs that could do with solar panels on them.
Thank you very much.
So thank you for the challenge. It's all about materiality. The single biggest issue to do with the garment factory, which is basically a big warehouse with hundreds of people working away in there, is social standards. The actual environmental impact of one of those big sheds is negligible compared to the carbon impact of the cotton field, the dye house, the wash cycle when people own it and throwing it away. So if I had £1 left to spend, I would spend it on getting social standards right in that factory, not environmental ones. Initially, I'll get to the environmental ones. In a dye house, it's a bit different. It's a small number of people, often very professional, working in a place that can have a huge environmental impact. Focus your pound on the environmental impact. So good challenge is just about priorities.
Yeah, final question here.
I'm Cilla Elworthy, a councillor with the World Future Council. And my question is about the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, the legislation that's currently on the table. And one aspect of which is that corporations will have the right to sue governments that pass legislation that affects their profitability. I'm quite surprised nobody's mentioned this, and I'd love to know what the panel think.
Let me kick off on this. I mean, this is a huge concern, actually. I mean, overall, the whole TTIP framework has got the potential, through harmonising of standards, to lower those standards. And obviously, from a WWF perspective, the concern around the environmental standards that could come down. So I think, firstly, whatever this agreement is, it must not lead to a lowering of these standards. We've talked, already about some really high standards around product design, eco-design, energy efficiency standards. Certainly, those must not be lowered at all. I think that's the first thing. And then the sort of interstate investor dispute settlement, which I think is what you're referring to, that clearly has got a huge threat, or poses a huge threat, and we're certainly pushing against that being something that the TTIP eventually has in it.
Anyone want to say something on TTIP? All right, I'm going to end it there. I'm going to just end with a final question of my own, and I guess apologies if I sound a little bit like a doom monger, but hopefully your responses will be the optimistic note we finish on. When we enter the next global recession, how much wind is going to be taken out of these coalitions?
All right, so you challenged a little bit earlier to say how will we feel in January next year at the back of Paris. Paris will.
I don't think we'll be in a global recession by January.
No,
but
I hope not desperately. I had enough of this.
But when times get really tough for the corporates,
Paris will be pragmatic. What Paris will do is unleash on business to say we need to step into this vacuum. Policymakers are not going to solve this quick enough. From 2016 onwards, you'll see a dramatically more engaged business sector in this space. Initially about managing risk, but increasingly about seizing opportunity, low carbon growth opportunities. Once you've got that momentum, which is about opportunity, whether austerity happens, whether we're in boom times, business tends to stick with it.
Okay.
And that's the shift in the mood music we'll
All
see.
right, Neil, same question to you.
I mean, I think it's a lot easier to do the sexier stuff in a business that's on the offense. You know, so when we were going through recession and when BT was uniquely focused on taking cost out of the business, about 4 billion in cost, there's a guy in this room tonight, Richard Tarboton, who led our energy management team, who actually took about 250 million out of our own operations in terms of both cost and carbon. And he had 30 people working for him, implementing the systems, putting all the controls in place. We built that as a competency. We then actually applied that to our supply chain, helping take the carbon burden out of our supply chain, helping Huawei, SGW and others as part of the Better Future Supplier Forum, then learn from us, and then we could pass that value through to our customers. Some of our customers are some of the biggest multinational companies in the world. So I think, you know, you can do that, and that is recession proof. However, doing the things we're talking about now, your business needs to be on the offense to do them and do them effectively.
Okay, interesting. And your perspective is going to be interesting here, Helen.
Yes, because I think it's about this alignment around resilience. So a lot of companies are seeing this as key to resilience, and resilience is really important in periods of economic downturn and recession. So it'll be some of the more interesting stuff at the top that will give away, and some of the more fundamental change that will stay.
And finally, Trevor.
Yeah, I mean, I would say a more sustainable economy is a more resilient economy. The point's already been made. And for businesses, it's a real opportunity to cut costs, increase competitiveness, whether it's through energy efficiency or whatever it might be. And therefore, actually, you know, a low-carbon economy, a low-carbon world must be much better positioned to come out of a recession than the other way around.
Okay. We covered an awful lot of ground. My thanks to Trevor Hutchins, Helen Wildsmith, Neil Dunn, and Mike Barry for a fascinating discussion. And thanks a lot to you for your questions. I'm going to hand it back to Jim now, but thank you very much indeed.